Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. It has been called the biggest hack in U.S. history. 80 countries targeted, including Canada. It was launched by the Chinese-sponsored group known as Salt Typhoon. This attack has reached nearly every American citizen, including the President of the United States. There are also concerns about the impact it had here in Canada. Anne Neuberger served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology in U.S. President Joe Biden's administration. She's now a distinguished lecturer at Stanford University. And good morning.
Good morning. It's good to be here with you.
It's good to have you here. The first question is, what is Salt Typhoon?
Great question. Salt Typhoon is the Chinese campaign to compromise telecoms around the world, but notably in the United States, with the goal of espionage, essentially collecting copies of conversations, getting into the lawful intercept systems that countries use to track, for example, law enforcement targets or individuals of intelligence interest, and potentially from China to preposition in those networks to disrupt them during a period of crisis.
The suggestion, as I said in the introduction, was that Salt Typhoon may have stolen information from every American. Is something like that possible?
It is possible, but the real point is we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because the Chinese approach was sophisticated in terms of getting on the networks and hiding their tracks. And many of the telecoms had inadequate cybersecurity and monitoring. So the Chinese may have been in some networks for as long as 3 years. And the fact that it took so long for telecoms and others to identify them leaves open questions of when the compromise started and how broad they were.
And among those, and we'll talk more about how this was done, but among those who could have been targeted were the president and vice president.
That is conceivably possible because where the Chinese were in those networks, they were positioned to make copies of calls of interest. And one would presume that high-level political leaders in multiple countries are of interest to Chinese intelligence interests.
Canadian networks also part of this operation?
Salt Typhoon typically refers to the broad compromise of numerous American ones, but we know that China compromised telecoms around the world, in the Pacific region, in Europe, and potentially other countries as well. How
did the hackers, and again, what do we know about the ties between this and the Chinese government? We could talk about how, but what do we know about how closely this is linked to the Chinese government?
We believe it is indeed the Chinese government. Some of the actors themselves may have been companies. The Chinese often use Chinese companies to conduct some of the bulk work of cyber hacking, but ultimately the customer for the intelligence that was gathered and the ultimate decider on the operations, we believe, was the Chinese government.
And so how did those hackers get access to networks in such an extensive way?
So it starts with the fact that it is far easier to attack than to defend. An attacker has to find one way in. A defender has to be monitoring every part of a network. And networks have become much more complex over the last number of years. Many more devices, software-defined approaches to optimize traffic. And cybersecurity in many cases did not keep up. So, for example, in one telecoms case, there was a device that hadn't been patched that served potentially as the point of entry. And once the attackers were on the network, stealing passwords, navigating, the Chinese invest a lot of time in studying a network, understanding who the leaders are, the network administrators who may have more rights on the network, understanding the configured devices, where they're vulnerable, and migrating themselves, navigating to the most valuable parts of the network, where they can make copies of calls, where they can see what traffic a given government may be monitoring, and pursue it from there. The Chinese do also a very good job of hiding their tracks, so it's often difficult to know afterwards what they actually compromised, how they came into the network, and what they've taken.
This sounds like a very long game.
It is a long game. Cybersecurity is fundamentally, it's not the kind of thing where it's one and done. It's more like good health, where it's something one does every day. But I think the key point is, because attacking is easier and because telecom is the most important part in many ways of a country's infrastructure, everything rides on our telecom. The nation's secrets, corporate intellectual property, individuals' phone calls, the fundamental privacy, private phone calls of citizens, from people from citizens to political leaders alike. As a result, telecoms are a high priority intelligence interest for adversarial countries, and they need to be a high priority cybersecurity for governments and the companies that own and operate these networks.
Let's talk just about how China approaches this. You wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, and the headline was, "China is winning the cyber war. America needs a new strategy of deterrence." How is China winning the cyber war? What is China doing that perhaps other nations aren't?
There's a fundamental difference between authoritarian countries and democracies when it comes to cybersecurity. China operates a great firewall, essentially a system of monitoring all across Chinese networks that started for domestic surveillance purposes. It extends to monitoring Chinese networks and being able to find and block attackers, in many cases before they get a foothold or quickly after they do. Canada, like the US, is a democracy, and as such, there's prescription on the government's role in monitoring private sector networks. In the United States, for example, the government does not monitor private sector networks, and as a result, it's left in the hands of private companies. And as you asked me earlier, when we're talking about, a smaller water company in Middle America, all the way through to a large telecom company, sometimes those companies, their cybersecurity is determined by the resource investments that they make. So there's a fundamental difference in how an authoritarian country monitors its networks and can block attacks and how a democracy does. With that said, we're proud democracies, of course, but that does lead to an asymmetry in cyberspace. Now, in the United States, in the last administration, policy was dramatically changed to put in place cybersecurity requirements for those private companies in many critical sectors, like pipelines, like airports, that didn't extend yet to regulations. And I believe in Canada, actually, there is proposed regulation to put in place some cybersecurity rules for telecoms because they're such a critical sector. You've seen countries around the world start to do that over the last number of years, from Australia to the UK to India.
In this piece, you run through a few scenarios about how this could play out, not just when it comes to this attack, this Salt Typhoon attack that we're talking about, but down the line. And you've mentioned a couple of times, for example, parts of infrastructure, water companies, power plants, water treatment facilities. Given the vulnerabilities that exist, what's at risk when it comes to those parts of our infrastructure?
What's at risk is two things. One is, of course, espionage, like in the telecom example. But the second is disruption. These are all systems connected to the internet. In many cases, they have interfaces open to the internet. We have seen in the United States attacks from Iran and Russia on water systems in a number of states, disrupting, forcing them to move to manual operations in terms of keeping water clean or purifying those water systems. And there have been also pre-positioning by China in other parts of infrastructure. We believe for the goal of disrupting them at a time when the Chinese government might want to put pressure on the U.S. government.
Just explain what you mean by pre-positioning.
So there are several steps to potentially hacking a target network. Step one is finding vulnerabilities on that network and then exploiting them to gain a foothold so that an attacker has a presence on the network and then studies it to determine if they wanted to block the operations of a network temporarily or permanently, how might they do that? And after they've done all of that mapping, an attacker will often stay on the network and bide their time to actually conduct that attack at the right time to achieve whatever their objective is. Geopolitics, to your point, plays out in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about a disruptive attack, it's generally one country against another country. So it's done for geopolitical purposes, for strategic purposes. But much as in traditional battle, capabilities are prepared in advance, tanks and airplanes, and operations are conducted, intelligence is conducted. That all plays out in cyberspace as well.
In the piece for Foreign Affairs, you give an example of Taiwan, and you write, during a crisis over Taiwan, these capabilities could prove decisive. Imagine the dilemma facing American leaders if China could credibly threaten to delay military mobilization by disrupting U.S. rail networks or triggering power failures across the eastern seaboard. What might unfold in a situation like that if China has pre-positioned actors in those parts of the infrastructure that are vulnerable?
Cyberspace does not have borders in the traditional sense of a battleground and a home front. And the United States, like Canada's core infrastructure, operates remotely, operates digitally, from our airports, air traffic control, to our power, to our pipelines. As China's offensive cyber program has become larger and more capable, we found evidence of prepositioning in parts of infrastructure in countries if used as competitors or adversaries around the world. So our concern is, given the knowledge of Chinese doctrine and the focus on active defense, moving first and disabling the enemy, that China would work to use these positions and infrastructure around the world to put pressure on those governments to say, do you really want to engage, for example, in a conflict halfway around the world when there's potentially this disruptive cyber impact at home?
That we're going to shut the lights off in the eastern seaboard of the United States if you interfere in a conflict in Taiwan, for example.
That's a rather dramatic example, but one that conceivably we want to ensure we put in place the cyber defense and security to make that impossible to happen. I think today there's that mismatch.
How do you go about defending yourself against something like that? If China has been at this game, and we call it a game, but has been at this for much longer than Canada and the United States have, and that they are winning the cyber war, is it possible to defend ourselves against this?
It absolutely is. And there's really three sets of steps that roll into that. One is there are some very practical steps in cybersecurity that are very high impact. Monitoring a network, putting in place, it's called multi-factor authentication, essentially a second factor beyond a password. Because today, stolen passwords are often still the way adversaries get into a network. Encrypting data, so even if data is stolen, for example, intelligence data of interest, it can't be used. So there's a small set of high impact cybersecurity practices, A. B, as you note in the article, I talk about the concept of using AI on cyber defense. Yeah. AI will be transformative in cybersecurity because one can train models across the data on a network, automate a lot of the manual repetitive work of cybersecurity so that talented professionals can actually focus on finding anomalies and blocking activity quickly. And in the context of a country, the most important systems we want to ensure can withstand attack are our critical infrastructure systems. So I talk about using a concept that's used across the commercial sector, digital twins, essentially virtual replicas of systems, to test offensive capabilities and determine what are the high-impact defensive steps that must be taken. Because fundamentally, one of the challenges we have in cybersecurity, these are live systems. So we often hesitate to properly red team them, test them, beat them up to determine what's the best way to defend them. So creating a virtual replica lets you actually test different attack techniques and ensure that you can defend against them and frankly spend your cybersecurity investments in the most high impact ways.
What has to be done and that's fascinating, creating a digital twin so that you can stress test the system without interrupting the system. What has to be done, do you think, at a governmental level? And I ask you this as somebody who has worked at high levels of government to make something like that happen.
Governments have models of systems like the energy grid. There's good partnership, for example, between Canada and the US, just to model how you would bring back an electricity grid after a devastating storm or after a flood. So taking those models and applying the next level of AI expertise to actually test traditional attack techniques and then take our intelligence regarding what we know about different countries and, frankly, criminals' attack techniques, model those out on those networks in partnership with the owners and operators, those sector leaders, and then building a cyber defense plan based upon that. Often what's hard in cybersecurity is it feels like it's defense in a vacuum. AI allows us to bring together the knowledge of what's going on a network, attack techniques, and the insights to say, what are the most impactful things to do about it?
What would you tell Canadian officials about how to protect against this type of attack going forward? There was a joint statement that came out, put out by a number of security agencies, including the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. What's the way forward for Canadian officials, do you think?
I would say three things. First, those statements have been a significant advancement done in the last few years of countries' intelligence services working together to raise awareness of the threat and include practical steps of what companies should do to defend against that threat. Those need to continue, along with the closed-door gatherings of key sector leaders to ensure that they're actually implementing that, learn what they're doing, and that back and forth between government, expert cyber defenders and private sector ones. That's one. The second is putting in place minimum cybersecurity requirements across key sectors, so we make it harder for the attackers. And the third is to use AI on defense, much as the digital twin or virtual replica concept we talked about, to ensure that the first time our networks see an attacker's techniques is not live, but instead modeling them in advance so we can prepare for them and secure against them.
How vulnerable do you think we are? I mean, again, I don't want to over-dramatize this, but in that piece that you wrote, it reads a bit like a nightmare scenario where you have these actors that are lurking on these networks right now. Is that possible? Do you think within those critical bits of infrastructure there could be attackers who are waiting for their moment?
You know, as you said, there's a balance between laying out what may be possible with the goal of calling for action because there are urgent gaps and saying this will happen. Today, it is technically possible for such attacks to be conducted. Obviously, such attacks would be a political decision made to achieve some political objectives. So our goal at this moment in time is to take the call to action to say we can technically defend, and we don't want to be in a political position to have one country be able to pressure another due to these major gaps in cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. So let's take these steps now to secure critical infrastructure in partnership with key countries that are some of our closest allies to ensure that both our citizens know they can trust the infrastructure their lives ride on, and that from a geopolitical perspective, we are not vulnerable.
Just last point, and you mentioned citizens. What is our role in this? Earlier, you talked about, multiple steps towards authentication. People might be driven crazy by two-factor authentication when they're just trying to log into their email, but that seems to be a key step if you work for a small or large company to keep bad actors out of that network.
You raise a good point. In the past, multi-factor authentication was hard to use. And if security is hard to use, people don't use it. Today, it's far easier. So, for example, if you're logging into email on your phone, you can use that hardware second factor the first time and then say, okay, I trust this device with this second factor to, for the future, log on to my email. There are today implementing second factor. The most important security step as individuals is that multi-factor step. There are many ways to do so. The weakest is, of course, like a text-based second factor. The best are hardware-based or passkeys. They're far easier to use, and I believe there are tutorials that, Canada's Cybersecurity Agency makes available and other services make available to help people take that step by step. Those are important things individuals can use so that their most sensitive data, their medical records, their financial records, are not at risk. I think the second step, I would say, and the two combined are powerful, is for individuals' most important data, keep a backup copy encrypted off of your network. And that way, if indeed somebody hacks into your computer, steals it, or locks your computer in a ransomware attack, you have a backup copy that you can restore from and go on with your life.
This is an important bit of advice. This is really, really interesting. I mean, it is scary, but it's fascinating the way that you have gamed this out and how we're not powerless, that the governments can act in the face of these sorts of threats. And thank you very much for this.
Truly my pleasure. Thank you.
Anne Neuberger is a former Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology in the Biden administration. She is now a distinguished lecturer at Stanford University. You've been listening to The Current Podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.